Hello and welcome back to the neighborhood. My name is Andrew and this is another video in my series that I am calling Filling the Hole Left by Souls. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Mortal Shell. First of all, what is Mortal Shell? You probably gathered from the intro and from the title that this is a Soulslike, but a little bit more specifically, Mortal Shell is a third-person action role-playing game focused on melee combat where players control one of several shell characters that have different playstyles. These shells are the main difference between this game and other Soulslikes. Each shell has a unique gameplay style that I'll talk about a little bit later. And the shell also has the ability to turn you into a statue that can either absorb incoming attacks, well, it can absorb one incoming attack, or it can add additional weight to an attack that you're making. The shell also allows for an interesting approach to death in this game. When you lose all of your health, you get knocked out of your shell, and in this state, you can only be hit once before dying, but you do have the chance to re-enter your shell to continue the fight. So let's start with the positives. What do I like about this game? The first thing that I want to talk about in the positive category is the aesthetic. I think this game nails the aesthetic that it's going for. It starts out very swampy and overgrown and overbearing. You feel oppressed in these opening levels, and then as the game progresses, the aesthetic takes a much darker, fantastical turn that I won't say that I wasn't expecting because I've played a lot of games like this, but that it was welcome. I enjoyed the change as the game progressed. It felt very Dark Souls swamp level inspired in the beginning, which will make Souls veterans feel right at home. And then it kind of takes a turn and finds its own visual style and aesthetic as you progress through the remainder of the game. And this applies to the items, the enemies, the NPCs that you're interacting with, the hubs that you are, or the hub that you make your home, the way that you reset, the bonfire equivalent, everything in this game feels of this world and feels like it should be here. Moving on, the main mechanic of the game that I've already referenced is the shells, and that is the core and the heart of Mortal Shell. It's in the name. So, in a typical Souls game, in the From games, you will pick a starting class that has a certain allocation of stats, and this kind of gives you a direction that you can take your character build if you want to, and then as you level up, you get more souls. You put those souls into the stats, and they allow you to use specific weapons or magics, etc., and then you craft a build around that mechanic. In Mortal Shell, you are this naked being called the Foundling, and you find these shells and you inhabit them, and there are 4 main shells in the game, and they each have their own different play style and special abilities. You can swap out weapons with them if you want to, but they have unique abilities. So the first shell is Heros the Vassal, which is kind of your starting, most balanced shell. Your health and stamina and your resolve, which is used for special attacks and things like that, is all pretty balanced. Then there is Solomon the Scholar, who is kind of like an upgraded version of the starting balanced build. You have more health and resolve, but other than that, it's pretty similar. Then there is Eridim the Venerable, which is your heavy build, your tank build. He has a massive health pool, but low stamina and resolve. So you swing once, you tank hits. It's your typical strength build if you're familiar with these games. And then there is Teal the Acolyte, and that is the rogue style build who has low health but high stamina. And so you can roll around and dodge attacks a lot easier. However, if you get hit too many times, you're going to go down because you just don't have the health pool to maintain that. So it's a much more fast-paced, agility-based playstyle. And so these shells determine kind of how you approach the game. I think I played a lot of the game as Solomon, and then towards the end I went more with the tank build, and I had a lot of fun with that. Like I said, you also have different weapons that you can find and unlock. So what do you do when you level up if you're not spending your currency that you are acquiring on leveling up skills like you would in a FromSoft game? Well, in Mortal Shell, you unlock predetermined abilities for that shell. And so the more you play a shell, the more abilities you unlock for it, the more powerful it becomes. So it does kind of pay to pick one and stick with it, and then maybe you can try another one for a New Game Plus cycle, or if you replay the game, something like that. The other thing that I really like about this game is there have been a couple DLC packs. And so the first one is the Rotten Autumn DLC pack, which adds a sick metal soundtrack to all of the boss fights. And that's just free. You can just install that if you want to. Or you can play without it, and the game will just have its traditional soundtrack behind your boss fights. The other DLC is much more of what you would expect from like a DLC expansion. There's a new shell and a new weapon type, but the really cool thing that they added to that DLC is a sort of roguelike mode. So when you go into the game, if you've already played it, if you've beat it, it allows new ways for the experience to stay fresh. I have not personally tried that mode yet. I don't have this DLC pack, but I think it sounds really cool, and I may actually go ahead and pick it up after recording this script. The other thing that I like about this game is that it's not too long, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. It being kind of on the simpler side of the Soulslikes, you only have your 4 main archetypes. You have maybe less build variety and less weapons and stuff than you would in, say, a Dark Souls game. If that were to go on for too long, it could definitely get stale. However, I don't think it does. On the flip side of that, I don't think it's too short where you feel like it wasn't worth it or you got ripped off. I think they found a really nice sweet spot in the game length. Now let's move into some of the things I don't like about Mortal Shell. The first thing is item familiarity. So they have this mechanic where when you pick up an item, you don't know what it does until you use it. So in order to learn what the items in the game do without consulting a guide, you have to use them, which sounds pretty interesting and kind of cool on the surface until you're in a tough spot and you pick up this item, and it's kind of like, finding a mushroom out in the woods, and it's like, oh, I could eat this and it could sustain me, or I could eat this and it could cut my health in half. And so you don't really know, and so then you end up, at least I ended up just kind of leaving a lot of items untouched in my inventory. Like I figured out what were like the healing items and some of the other items in the game that would benefit me, and I kind of just stuck to those and ignored a lot of the others. So I think that mechanic ultimately, at least for me, hurt the experimentation and hurt my use of the items. And I don't think that was a positive benefit for the creativity that they were going for. The other thing in this negative category is that the levels can be pretty challenging. Enemy placement can be a bit aggressive in some situations, and some of the runs between resting points or to bosses or things like that can be a little bit of a grind sometimes. Nothing too extreme if you're familiar with this genre. But the flip side of that is that the mechanic that the shell has that I think is pretty cool, where you can harden and absorb a hit, means that it can be pretty easy to cheese bosses. You can abuse that mechanic pretty easily and just kind of tank hits if you need to. That said, some of the later bosses, it doesn't really matter if you're using that mechanic or not. They can still be pretty tough. So there are some more balanced fights, I would say, but a lot of them, especially early on with the hardened mechanic, you can kind of get through most bosses on like your first or second attempt. In some games in this genre, the whole point, the main focus is like these epic boss battles that you have to persevere through. I think that's kind of lacking in Mortal Shell. And then the last thing I'll talk about in the negatives is just that there is a little bit of that like double A studio jank in Mortal Shell. It's not so much that it's unforgivable. I beat the entire game. I had a good time with it. But in this genre specifically with Souls-likes, you really want the responsiveness and you really want to feel like you're in control of your character at all times. And if the game is ever fighting you on that, or if the game is ever the reason that you lose to a tough boss fight and it wasn't your fault, but it was something to do with like a performance issue or a little bit of jank, that can be frustrating. So I just figured it was worth pointing out here. I don't think that it's excessive. It's not like Lords of the Fallen or anything like that. But you can tell that this game was made by a smaller studio. That being said, that smaller studio has a ton of passion for this genre and for this game, and it shows through. And I really think that this was a very good foundation for a series if they decide to go with that. And I'm excited to see what they do in the future if they continue with Mortal Shell as a series. So who would I recommend Mortal Shell to? Well, first of all, I would recommend this game to anybody that's like me and just cannot get enough of the Souls-like genre. I know that's not everybody. I know a lot of people out there are starting to feel like this genre is getting saturated. For me personally, I still love this genre. I still like to check out any game that I can that comes to it. And every now and then we get gems like Lies of P, for example. And I think that Mortal Shell stacks up to that pretty well. I don't think it's as good as Lies of P, but I do think it is in the upper tier of Souls-like games. So if you love Souls-likes like me, definitely check Mortal Shell out. I would also recommend it to people who love FromSoft games and are just looking for something to scratch the itch between their releases. This is similar to the last group of people I talked about. It's like you love these games, but you gotta wait for the next big From game to come out. Well, here's a smaller, unique experience off to the side that you can play over the course of a week and probably have a good time with. I will say this is not a great title to get into the genre. I think that if you're trying to get into Souls-likes, there are better options like Wo Long Fallen Dynasty or Jedi Fallen Order, games that are Souls-like, Souls adjacent, but either have difficulty options or just have easier gameplay or let you abuse co-op or whatever the case may be. I think there are easier options to circumvent difficulty if that's what's holding you back. And if that isn't what's holding you back from trying out these games and you're not worried about the difficulty, then go ahead and just play a FromSoft game. Play the Dark Souls games, play Bloodborne, play Elden Ring, and then you can kind of branch out from there, because obviously those are kind of the cream of the crop when we're talking about Souls. With all that being said, what verdict would I give Mortal Shell? So if From Software games are S tier, and I think a lot of them are, then Mortal Shell is sitting at a B. Like I said, there are some negatives to this game. There's a little bit of jank. There are a few things that I would like to see improved in future installments or future games from this studio. However, if you're like me and you like Souls-likes, this is definitely one to try. This is a really good time. It's a fantastic title that I think holds its own in the Souls-like genre and is at the upper end of the non-From Software Souls-like games. But what do you think? If you've played Mortal Shell, let me know in the comments. Would you agree? Do you think this is worth playing? Is it worth your time? Also, if you enjoyed this video or any of the other content on this channel, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe and leave a like. It really helps us out with the almighty YouTube algorithm. That's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, stay friendly, gamers.